All right, should we get things started? I think one of the most interesting parts of this is how we value our business. It's surprising, I think, to some of us when the time comes and we get a valuation, how little our business is worth. And that can be somewhat heartbreaking after you spent 20 years of doing business. You've really invested, maybe didn't take as much money out as you wanted to, or kind of paid you the lower end of the salary range, knowing that you were the business owner and there was assets in the business. And even some of you, you have business partners with this idea that equity is a play. That was always something that was to negotiated with. And then to think that equity is not worth something after years and years of contributing. So that's one of the things that Joe and I would love to help you avoid is that surprise, first of all, but also the ability to not or to have an asset that's worth something and avoid that pitfall of having it be worth nothing. And it's actually not that difficult once you start focusing on your business as an asset to start performing differently and get the asset returns that you want to. What is difficult is that it takes time to do it. So, one of the things I point out is often by the time you start an acquisition, the idea of being acquired and the time that you finish, it's about 7 years. And really, truly, we begin the process about 3 years into the 7 years because often the first thing that you're doing in an acquisition process is doing a 3-year look back at your company and your company's performance to determine the value of that business. So the previous 3 years to the year you're getting evaluation is 3 years into a 7-year process, and then it takes you about a year to find a potential partner, negotiate the terms, merge, maybe even a year and a half to finally get the machine up and running. And then the performance you required after acquisition, it's not uncommon to do 2 or 3 years of earnout, meaning after you get acquired, the company acquiring you wants you to stay in your job and keep the revenue going as you always have for at least 2 or 3 more years. So you add all those years up, that's a 7-year window that it takes to do it. But it's that 3 years into it moment that if you don't prepare for that moment, you might be surprised what little your company is worth. You can jump in here, Joe. Any other thoughts?
I think you summed that up really nicely. One of the things for me, if you think about your business as an asset, the conversation we started last week is relevant to me because that asset is built up of assets that are not just the revenue that company produces or generates and the profit it produces as a result. It is the things that go into generating that revenue and producing that profit. And so for you as a business owner, you need to level up your entrepreneurial energy. You need to level up the places that you spend your time and direct your staff's time to making sure that you are building those core building block assets and not just burning the candle on both ends, generating revenue and making sure you squeak out a profit. And so we talked about some types of assets that help facilitate that sort of 3-year process to make your business worth it. And what we're going to get into when we talk about what your business is worth, how multiples work, we're going to talk about how those sort of classes, if you will, of assets that we started talking about last week are relevant to the factors that buyers look at when they're saying, what is this business worth and should I even buy it?
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, so let's talk about the valuation process. So one of the things that we're familiar with when it comes to how our company is going to be valued is the revenue that we generate. So revenue generated is like the total revenue we bring in as a business. If you generate $200,000 a year in business, you're clearly not worth as much as if you're generating $20 million a year in revenue in business. So one of the key factors that we're dealing with when it comes to multiplier is revenue. So revenue, we often have somewhat in our control. Many of us are in a certain marketplace. There are services that we provide. There's a price that we're asking for. And then there's a number of clients or projects we work with. And all of those kind of add up to a total revenue we work with. Sometimes we don't totally control what clients are willing to pay for our services. So if we were here's an easy example that none of us do, so I can use it. Is like if we were making wedding videos, like wedding videos go for $8,000 a pop. You spend a weekend doing it. It's a really clear service that you can provide for people. When you're doing, entertainment marketing or entertainment branding, that range can be somewhere between $10,000 and $150,000 for a piece that you're doing, depending on what the client's needs are, who the client is, and so on. And then if you're doing commercial work, you might be going somewhere between, $50,000 and $350,000 for a commercial spot. And then if you're an agency and doing strategy, you can be asking for upwards of $1 million and $2 million for an annual contract. And therefore you're getting to the 8, 10, 12, 16, $20 million a year revenue cycles you're doing. So we control some of that slightly by where we sit in the marketplace and the position that we have in that marketplace, and then the value we can ask because of the work that we produce within that. Go ahead, Joe. Whenever I stop talking, I just want you to jump in, I guess.
Oh, I can't tell. Like at some point there's a slide, so I can't tell if you're ever
Oh yeah, I could jump to the slide in a second, but I thought we could just cover some of the big pieces right now.
Well, I think you've covered revenue. Well, I want to know where you were going next, honestly, before I jump in.
Yeah. Well, just on the revenue side, anything else that you can think of just controlling revenue? Yeah. The other side. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So let's say the other side that we control the valuation of our business is on the expense side. So we often think of this as a business owner as like the efficiency side of things. So who we have that work for us within our business, our staff and freelance makeup for the services that we provide. Sometimes certain people we have and titles that we have on, a creative director, a strategist, art directors, and so on, are revenue generating people. Our account management team or our sales team are guaranteeing revenue. So there's a part there, but they're also an expense item. So we also control expenses and therefore controlling a profitability of our business. So our valuation and the uniqueness of our company to get, that stack, revenue control and expense control, which is mostly what we focus on at a day-to-day running a business, has some purpose in our evaluation. But this might be surprising to you. It has very, very little effect on the overall value of your business if you're only worrying about your profit and loss statement. Because there are assets that we generate within our business that are related to our profit and loss, but actually there are areas that we control and need to lock in to guarantee some return for a future investor or buyer that we have to understand more clearly so that we can work on those on a day-to-day basis, those operational areas on a day-to-day basis, and increase our value as a business and as an asset in and of itself.
And that is the difference between what we call shareholder value and what we call enterprise value. The fact that you can generate revenue and manage that revenue to produce profit is really great for you, a shareholder. That's awesome. It's the first thing a potential buyer is going to look at, and they're going to be like, congrats, you did it. And then they're going to move on so fast, it's going to shock you and make you sad in your heart how little they care. To pick up on Tim's point, then they're going to ask, how did you generate it? What are the means by which it was produced? And if something happened to you and every one of your clients and every member of your staff, how easily could it be replicated by another human being, right? With another set of clients, with another set of processes. And if that stuff isn't locked in place, the fact that you generated a bunch of revenue and it produced a bunch of profit is going to be so radically immaterial when we get to what we call your valuation multiple, that it's just going to make you sad. So we want to talk about multiples a little bit. Again, the sort of assets we can build and the levers we can pull to increase the value of those assets is going to be really important, because if we spend our lives sort of hand-wringing about revenue and profit, we're not going to get where we want to go.
Okay, so let's talk about the multiple real quick. I'm just going to do this on a simple spreadsheet because I speak spreadsheet language as a second language, so it's much easier for me to explain things on spreadsheet. Okay, so here's the areas that we've been talking about so far: revenue control, expense control, and therefore bottom line profit. I put an example here that's really, really obvious. Here's a company that generated $2 million in revenue. They have expenses of $1.9 million. They have a profit of $100,000 or 5%. A company that's set up with only these controls in place would basically be worth, this is such a low number. This is too much of a high number, and this profit margin is not enough, that the company is not worth anything as a multiplier. So 100,000 times 0 equals 0. You basically are running a cash flow business. Not that it's worthless to you, But the minute someone else wants to buy it, they would just want to have to buy themselves a job the same way you have bought yourself a job and are keeping something going. Go ahead, Phil.
Where does a zero come from? Because anything times zero is going to equal zero.
That's right. That's right. The zero is basically we'll call the term I often use is like the unicorn factor, how unique you are in the marketplace that you can differentiate yourself from somebody else. If you're not unique at all, like in this case, you're not unique from anybody. It's your company isn't worth anything to anybody else that's going to buy it. So your company is worthless to a buyer. It's worth something to you because it's a cash flow business. It's a career that you have, and it's a business you've been running. And if you keep it going, you could still make money from it. But another person coming in and taking control of your business, they're basically just bought themselves a job. It doesn't have any enterprise value to it. So
So
that's
that's your
why,
multiplier here.
yeah.
Yeah.
One example might be if I had $1 million in expenses instead of, oh, that's $10 million in expenses. That'd be really bad. If I was making 50% profit on this $2 million, this is somewhat unique. So this might be worth 2 times the value of the profit. So the profit times the valuation multiplier 2. This company might be worth $2 million. Why? Because in a 2-year period, the person buying your business would get their money back. And if I bought your business and told you, hey, I need you to run this business for 2 years, I'll give you $2 million. You're basically they're going to give you $2 million, and you're going to give them $2 million back. So it's a break even. In the third year, they would run the business, maybe somewhat different than you would be running the business, and they would be making $1 million a year without you. But really, their investment in you is somewhat guaranteed because you're going to give them that money right back over the 2-year period that they're requiring you to work for them. So that multiplier here is based off of the profitability, this 50% profit, and this unique relationship you have with your revenue that you're only spending half of the money and you're capturing the other half of profitability. So these are controls that we're used to and we often think about is the revenue control, the expense control, therefore the profit and the multiplier attached to that. It's possible you can negotiate this like 3 times or something like that based off other negotiating terms. But for a valuation part of it, Joe and I really want to focus on just this cell right here today. What makes that revenue different? So I'm going to make something more realistic. So $2 million business, I'm going to say this is 1,600,000. So 20% profit. This is somewhat average, right? Maybe a lot of us are really working between 10 and 20%. But if you're going to sell your business, I would say sell your business generating 20% profit over the last 3 years. So if you are interested in your selling business, think about focusing the next 3 years, doing all you can to get as close to 20% profit as possible, because now I'm somewhat unique in the marketplace. And this is showing that I have some control over my expenses. And because I have control over my expenses, especially if this is like an operational control, meaning a producer can do it without you doing it, then this idea of $400,000 being repeatable, maybe for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years, the client is going to they're going to think of like this as, hey, in a 5-year period, at $400,000 a year, they're going to think of they're going to receive about $2 million in revenue from you, and they're going to give you a piece of this. They'll give you about 2.5, a valuation of 2.5. So they'll give you $1 million for your business for what they'll get back in a 5-year period of $2 million. Or what they're going to be receiving is 20% return on investment, because they'll make the same money. They'll double their money, their $1 million investment in a 5-year period. If you double your money in 5 years, it's a 20% return. If you double your money in 2 years, it's a 50% return. If you doubled your money in 10 years, it's a 10% return. So it's really the number of years it takes divided by 100. That's the return on investment. So if someone looking for a 20% return on investment and you could show them that you can get $400,000 in profit, you get a 2.5 times multiplier. This is what your company is worth. That's what they would be willing to give you. in a certain package. And that becomes the valuation and then what the dollar amount is here. So our big picture that we want to focus on is what this gets to, and really want to show you how to get this to 4, to 5, to 7, to 8, sometimes 8 times. A company I worked with last year was offered 12 times their profit for their situation. Now, their company was about 12 million in revenue, and they were still hitting a profit margin of about 20%. Oh, I need another zero there. So they were unique because they had a 12%. They were making a profit of $2 million a year, but specifically what they did and who they did it with, meaning some AORs and different clients they worked with, allow for this multiplier to increase. So the future buyer knew they were going to get 8 to 12%, 12 times off of the buyer, and they're willing to offer 8% down, and then let it rest for 2 years and get another 4% multiplier at the end if we hit certain performance metrics. So big range there, 8 to 12.
And we'll talk about some of the levers that drive this. I think the straight up 2.5x multiplier that Tim outlined is a really standard case for a well-functioning creative firm that gives off a bit of profit, that has some value to a buyer and is maybe interesting, but is otherwise pretty standard in its category. I think it's a really great place to start. A mentor of mine sold a digital agency doing $40 million in revenue and 20% profit for 9x EBITDA. He had an exceptionally rigorous proprietary process. I'm going to cheat ahead a little bit, but we did talk proprietary process last week that allowed him to really command an exceptionally high multiple. And then his second business is essentially taking and licensing that proprietary process that he was able to take parts and pieces out of as a negotiating tool within that acquisition. And so when we think about these things, proprietary process seems like a nice to have. I'm running a creative business. I don't have time for that, but it may be the difference between a 2, a 4, a 5, and a 9x multiple.
You actually pointed to something, Joe, we probably should have highlighted before I jumped ahead. But in reality, sometimes this profit margin, these expenses might go up to 11. But if we change this from profit, so if I use usual P&L, revenue minus expenses, and looking at profit, if I change this to EBITDA, as Joe mentioned before, which is earnings before interest, tax, appreciation, EBIT.
Yeah, there's a D in there. Put it after the T.
Yeah,
we'll be all right.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Distributions. What the distributions part of it is, you as a business owner might be looking at a P&L that looked like $1 million, but when I add back, I add back to my expenses, I might have paid taxes, paid distributions, paid on amortization. I add that back to it. This $1 million becomes, this $11 million actually becomes $10 million in expenses, because those are expenses that you get credit for. And so by changing it from profit to EBITDA, you actually could show more on the bottom line than if you were just looking at your total net profit number. And you can measure this out very easily by looking at your basic P&L, and these items are often listed on your P&L, especially distributions. As a single business owner, you might be distributing to yourself a larger piece of the profit that the new owner would get those distributions going to them. And so it's added to your bottom line and gives you this higher number here. So EBITDA is what we often use to value not just the net profit item, but EBITDA, which is usually a higher number than profit itself. So it's the EBITDA times the multiplier gives us the value. So I kind of wanted to just show you the principle of the multiplier too, and then answer the real question you guys have is like, what actually affects that multiplier? How do I get more from it, right? That's probably the real question we have. So here's the items that I actually took a class from this guy, John Werlow. He has a pretty strong book about selling a professional service company. And these are the cost controllers or the multiplier controllers that we mostly are affected with within creative agencies. The first one that affects your multiplier. So this is, again, just imagine making the same EBITDA But having control over these 5 items and not having to change revenue, not having to change expenses, but changing these items could increase that multiplier from like a 2.5 to 3.5 or 4 by the more clarity you have in these areas and the better performance you have within these areas. So the first one is financial performance. Financial performance here does not necessarily mean just the ability to make profit. It's the ability to make profit consistently. So if I'm looking 3-year look back or a 5-year look back at your books, and year over year, you're making 20% profit. Now I can see you have a financial performance track record that most likely, if I predicted that same process forward for the next 3 or 5 years, we'd get similar returns on it. So that's the first one, is just like the financial performance, knowing we can somewhat lock in it. But the second one is, and Trista will like this one because this is Trista's secret formula. It's your ability to record and report that. So visibility into this financial performance is also important. It's why, and some of the value we get in doing regular cash flow routines, doing a production roll up, managing our accounts receivable, these items that we often do at RevThink within our CreOS system, is to show those decisions and how often you make smart decisions based off of that performance. So not just having the ability to show it, but the ability to replicate it and kind of even pass on that financial performance to a new finance team if you needed to. So you can say, hey, here's our system, here's our process, here's the dashboard that we use. If I hand this over to you, I can show you all of the controls. You can see when things are over and under, and therefore you could respond and reduce your team, or increase your team, and improve your sales performance, reduce production performance, things that you are currently making as a decision maker. You can pass off that decision making to somebody else. So financial performance is not just the ability to make profit, but the ability to transfer that knowledge from you to somebody else is another piece of it. And that increases your multiplier. Same revenue, same EBITDA, but your multiplier goes up because you have a system like that in place.
And when we say visibility too, I want to add some practical clarity in that if quarter one you had 20% net profit and quarter two you had 15% net profit, there's going to be a question why. And if the answer is I don't know, you don't have visibility, right? You don't have the financial performance that Tim is talking about. If the answer is we did better, you don't have visibility into your financial performance. If the answer is we invested strategically in 2 hires in office space in X, Y, and Z, you have the financial performance that Tim is talking about. And so there is a level of rigor that goes with this, that it's like, we want to be prepared for these conversations. It's not just about like, you don't want to look like you don't have egg on your face when somebody asks you why. It's that you need to have the answer. If you want to be a 4x multiple business and not a 2x multiple business, it is a requirement.
Yeah. And I can't even say some of the scrutiny we went through with that larger sale that I did with those guys was when things changed, because the marketplace changed, they were asking us specifically to analyze what changed, what's the difference, and what would the future performance be. And we can get down to it because we have the analytical tools in place, and that those tools are easily transferable and matching to their analytical tools. So we can basically speak each other's language. So you can't just hope someday your company's worth something and not have like financial education, financial maturity in your process. That's a big part of it. Okay, so the second one is growth potential. Growth potential is, we often think of growth potential as like growing our team or growing our clients. So for example, you might say, I currently work with CBS, but now that, Paramount bought Warner Brothers Discovery and I have this really good client, I'll also be able to add all the Turner networks to my client relationship. That's how we often think of it. That's actually not very strong and potential growth for the client, because that same relationship or that same theory you have can work the opposite. Yeah, but what if your friend gets fired? Now, like that totally disappears. This growth potential has a different element to it. So what you're looking at is the ability to show that the future buyer that when opportunities come, you know how to absorb those opportunities into your business. Not specific opportunities, but when they come. Because more often than not, the person buying your professional service company owns one themselves. So a very common one I see for motion design companies is like a PR company trying to buy a post or motion design company or animation company or live action company, because they already have an existing client base and they don't serve those clients with your capabilities. So they want to know, hey, you're doing this for this segment over there. That's great. Don't change that. That's what we're buying. But if we started giving you these clients that we actually have and you had to start servicing them, would you be able to take on that growth easily? Or would that be a distraction to you? Would we hurt the overall system? So that's what the ability of performance, like production performance and the ability to deliver, is really, really important. The ability to understand and absorb new systems or new clients, showing a kind of like a industry knowledge, industry kind of valuation and purpose, and to show that you can grow and absorb these new clients that they're bringing with you makes you a lot more valuable. And again, that the company I worked with last year, that's what they're looking at. They had a segment completely different than the one that the seller was putting out there, but the two could easily meld together, and therefore the performance of both businesses would grow. Buyer and the seller's businesses would get a valuation increase, and that's why it was worth so much more to the two of them to merge together.
And I'll say in this scenario, those of you who hang out with me a lot know I'm always talking about adjacency, articulating your value in adjacent verticals or through adjacent adjacent horizontal specialties. It's not like I do work in this category, so I want to get more in this category. It's proving that the value we demonstrated in this category is transferable to an adjacent category. This is what we talk about when we're talking about demonstrating growth potential. If I'm real good at shooting, live action DR spots for dentists, I bet if I can demonstrate that I would be really good at shooting live action DR spots for optometrists, then there is growth potential there that we can demonstrate. And that is what we're talking about in practice. That makes the difference between having a book that articulates growth potential or a reel that articulates growth potential and one that doesn't.
Yeah, that's a real example. I had a company that works heavily in the tech industry. Their buyer was from pharmaceuticals. But when you look at what they did, they basically explained complicated things in a very simple terms. So medicine can be complicated, and technology be complicated, and they had the ability of doing that. So there was growth potential in a new segment by replicating their current process and the knowledge base they had and the team they had, and keep on growing that way. If there's no room for growth, then you're now at a multiplier of 1 or 0 again, because they're willing to give you a piece of their growth up front, because they're looking at 5 times growth. They're willing to give you that 2.5 times growth. So that's where that multiplier changes. Okay, reoccurring revenue. This is actually good news for most of us, because I think this is where most of us put our effort in on a day-to-day basis. We like reoccurring revenue. That's what we focus on. That's how we keep our lights on, and that's the work that we're doing.
That's how we sleep at night.
We really love this stuff. And these are the areas where, like, being an agency of record or having long-term contracts or having repeatable business in a certain models, those would be really ideal. What makes the difference here, also very good news for most of you, is who you are in your brand and your positioning. Because the more you're known, the more people have a desire to work with you, the more security there is that there'll be reoccurring revenue from those same clients you've worked with year over year. An easy way to look at this is look at your last 3 years, print out your client list for the last 3 years and see what percentage of your clients repeat year over year over the last 3 years, and which ones fade off. If you're looking at 90 to 100% non-reoccurring clients, you couldn't convince somebody, yeah, but after you buy me, they will stay reoccurring. No, you kind of have to prove it year over year. But you don't want to have 100% reoccurring revenue, because then you have really a gorilla client, and we're missing the previous bullet point, which is growth potential. You're not showing any ability to take on new clients and new work. You're just servicing the same few clients. So it is somewhat of a balanced understanding, but the two work hand in hand.
And I'll say here, as long as we're talking about pulling it from the philosophical to the practical, I've heard what I suspect all of you might be thinking. And we have a project-based business. This is a project-based industry. It would be really nice if recurring revenue were real, but it's not real. What do we do about it? My guess would be if you've got a healthy business, you've got clients who come back to you year over year or multiple projects within the year. If we're looking strictly through the lens of trying to increase your valuation multiple, it's really just a matter of making sure that on paper, we know that those projects are happening. So, hey, client A, last year we did 12 projects together. Do you think we are going to do the same 12 things again this year? If so, we're going to lock in rates if you're willing to say you'll do 4 this quarter. And then if that works, let's lock in the exact same rate. We're not going to push to a rate increase, and we're going to do 4 next quarter. Now, all of a sudden, you've got a piece of paper that says, I've got 4 projects this quarter, and another piece of paper that says, I've got 4 projects next quarter. This is the same project-based business. It's the same way you've always interacted with your client, but through the lens of the buyer, this is a firm who was able to go out and get 2 pieces of paper signed that says they've got 8 projects. That's the difference in your valuation multiple between somebody who's just like, oh yeah, no, that client's my friend, they're going to call me. Nobody wants that firm.
Yeah. What's interesting, I think, if you focus on selling your business instead of just trying to maintain and run it year over year, you actually might ask something different from those clients, or you might pursue clients that aren't necessarily your number 1 and number 2 targets out there, but they give reoccurring revenue, and you know that it's going to affect that multiplier. Well, then you kind of focus on that and work with that for the next 2 to 3 years, and know that increases that your multiplier. It's really worth the effort to start focusing on these items, even if it's not something you've always done or always wanted to do, but with that exit in mind, it might be really important. All right, monopoly of control. People don't like this word monopoly, but it's a really good term that fits in here well. Monopoly of control kind of just, you can imagine like this is where the dominant force is in the marketplace. These are where the larger agencies or the well-known agencies in certain segments might be able to monopolize a lot of the opportunities that are out there. It doesn't necessarily have to be in size. You can imagine like there might be a really large agency that you're pitching against all the time, and like, oh man, that agency, that studio, pitching against them, they're most likely the favorite because they're well known and they get most of the work. Whenever you're recognizing that person that you're competing with has a monopoly of control, and you want to have that yourself. This can be in segments, and when you're positioning yourself for a sell, you can recognize that. Maybe on certain projects or in a certain marketplace, you're not the first one that's being considered, but in another marketplace you are. Therefore, when you're looking for a buyer for your business, you might be looking for a buyer that would appreciate where you do have a monopoly of control and you can do it. And I'd even say like double down and focus on that. This is where if you were to invest in a new person, bring on a new hire over the next couple of years, you might strategically hire somebody that would create more of this control than be a generalist in a certain area.
I actually spoke to a former client today who asked me a very similar question. Interested in hiring for someone in a growth role, what do you think I should do? And I was like, can you just hire your best client? Like, honestly, can you hire a person who knows the category in which you often perform better than you know that category? I don't know why you would hire an agency biz dev person who has an alleged book of alleged clients in a bunch of alleged categories. If you're the best at live action for dentists, to pull that one all the way through,
You love that one.
right? Yeah, you should hire the world's best dental practice branding person, and that person should sell 1 million dental projects a year and solve that problem over and over and over again and solidify your monopoly of control.
Yeah, totally different position or a way of looking at it than when you were starting your business and trying to think about what you wanted to do for the next 20 to 25 years. Now you're looking at something that would be valuable to sell, which in the next 3 to 5 years, and then what it means to kind of build a business that does that. So you think differently and you acquire differently and you build differently. This last one is kind of easy. I think a lot of us kind of know this already, but we call this dependency neutrality. And what that means is not being dependent on any single source or need or person to get things done. Where this fits well within where people make this mistake of not having neutrality in our marketplace is often like in visual effects, where the only way we're making money is because we're using Canadian labor to get this visual effects done. Oh, wait, Trump is starting a war with Canada. Now all of a sudden our margin goes to zero. That can be done in certain marketplaces when we're using labor and we're saying yes to projects that aren't worth very much because we're dependent on outside labor, outside forces to do it. And then those things change. So when we say dependency neutrality, we're saying like making a business that isn't not dependent on specific talent or labor or practices to get something done, maybe even technology, needing a certain computer or certain piece of software to get something done, or being known as a specialist with a certain piece of software, and that software becomes meaningless because of an AI takeover. That would hurt the value of your business. So the more neutral you are to any of those dependencies, the more value your company come, or there's less risk in acquiring you, therefore more value for your business. This is where if you don't have this right, your multiplier might go down more than go up because of that work.
And I would say being dependent on a labor force at a certain rate is obvious. Being dependent on talent is also obvious. If you have a producer or a creative director and you think about what would happen if that person quit and you cry yourself to sleep, you have a dependency. If you go on vacation and you answer emails every morning, you have a founder dependency. We talk about founder dependency a lot. That is obviously the worst one. And to double click on Tim's point, not only will your multiple not go up, it will go down in a drastic way that may cause a buyer to walk away from a deal entirely, or they might just try and hire you. They might just say, why don't you walk away from that business and I'll just pay you a salary? It seems like you're doing it all anyway. These are the types of things that happen when you build a business that cannot run without you or cannot run without a particular person within that firm. And so we had a nice conversation last week about process, which we're going to talk about again. But even if the process requires a person to function, you have a dependency and you are not dependency neutral. This is a very, very big one when we talk about the difference between the peak and valley and how it affects your multiple.
Yeah. Yeah, Joe, you're kind of approaching that spoken wheel method where a lot of business owners put them at the center of all decision making, and nothing can happen without them in the center of it. And they haven't built an operational system where elements talk to each other. Production talks to finance, finance talks to sales, without having the business owner interpret everything in the middle. So you can do the biggest harm to your business because the only way to acquire you is really an acqui-hire. I'm actually hiring you to make the decisions within my business, but I'm not acquiring any other. The system itself that you've built is meaningless without you, so it doesn't have any value. You might be valuable because you're really, really smart and you might be valuable over here, but the rest of this thing has no value to it. And therefore, like you're really just going to get like maybe some security on your salary, on your take home pay for a few years, but you're not going to get a multiplier greater than that in an acquisition.
Yeah, in that case, you are literally building a negative asset, which is a tough place to be for all the effort it takes to build a business.
Yeah, such a bummer. I'm going to compare this to what you did last week, where you talked about the transferable assets and you brought up these items here, Joe. Proprietary process, the POV brand, vertical positioning, and then owning a piece of intellectual property. These transferable assets are related to these aspects of a multiplier and actually have like somewhat of a one-to-one correspondence to the areas that we're talking about. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a one-to-one, and there's definitely a bit of an overlap. So again, process is sometimes feels like a dirty word in a creative firm, and sometimes just feels like the thing we care the least about. But I like to bring it back to if your best producer quit, would your firm run the same way? If all of your producers quit, would your firm run the same way? If the answer is no, you have no process. But if that process is such that you could just bring in a whole sort of like new set of freelance producers and it would run uninterrupted, that thing has potential to be an asset that another firm would want to buy, a complementary firm or a higher level buyer, and that asset might have value. That value is related to your financial performance because it's related to predictability and it's related to visibility. That's a really, really big deal.
Yeah, and the idea of transferable assets have a little bit like a bespoke nature to it too. Like you can imagine, I don't know if any of you guys listening would have this necessarily, but like as a business owner, you've done a practice for certain years in financial performance, for example, And now, as part of that, you developed your own proprietary soft process. You could close your production company and just sell that process to people because you learned how to do that. I know an agency out of the San Francisco area that did exactly that. They ran a production company for 20 years and they wrote their own production software. And now they're like, maybe we should just sell the production software as a separate transferable asset, separate from the company that we're running. And they created two different brands and two different businesses to do that. So some of these transferable assets have that ability of saying, hey, I can actually develop something and peel it off and create a totally different type of business within it. In a buyer position, they might want to combine that. Oh, yeah, that creates the unique positioning and a monopoly control because of your vertical positioning. These two things can correspond to and make a lot more value if you're selling the whole business or selling the asset by itself.
I love that. And even if you don't want to go as far as to sort of spin that off and offer it as its own business, it's a simple smell test. If another firm would look at your process and say, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's different and better. Oh, we didn't think of it that way. And we might have some benefit in running our projects this way. You have a process that has value and has the potential when essentially branded and marketed the right way to be a valuation multiple increasing asset. If
Yeah.
you have no process, or if you have a process that another firm would look at and say, what is happening here? You have the potential for a negative asset on your hands. It's
Yeah.
pretty binary in that way.
Okay, so those are big thoughts. Any questions that you guys have or situations you've been in before or heard stories of that we would be helpful and process together? Any of this scare you? Yeah, go ahead, Lewis.
I've been in a few situations that have been pretty bad with regard to this. I only have a few minutes, but I just wanted to say them real quick. This process is really grueling, like you said. Um, like there was a company in LA that wanted to work with us, and it was backed by private equity, and it was a mess, and it cost me like tens of thousands of dollars to go through the process, and it was not worth it at all. And then I had another one in New York where it was a media agency that wanted a creative arm, and that one I was actually pretty excited about because a former boss of mine was there, and I thought it might be really exciting. And it was also something that we always were missing out on, not having media. And that was a nightmare because they had a holding company come in and buy one of their companies and with private equity, and the one of the people who was still there, one of the owners, obviously didn't want to leave yet and couldn't leave yet, and still had all this like um power that wasn't really that much power, but like was annoying basically. And I was like, who do I report to? Like, is it that guy at the end of the table who's sticking around? Like, or is it you, like private equity guy? Like, I mean, it was just really hard. And I wasted tens of thousands of dollars again. I just want to make sure that everybody knows if they go through the process, like legal fees, it's a lot of money. I don't
Yeah.
have an MBA, by the way, so I had to go through this with my lawyer and accountant, and it was really, really hard and really made soured me on the whole thing.
Yeah, that's a great warning, by the way. I know people that hire the broker first when they're paying their broker fee. The broker sends them a lot of opportunities. Most of them are worthless to them, but they, without any exposure or understanding of what those opportunities are, you pursue some of the ones that are not going to be good in nature, but you don't know any better. And you can just call that an education fee to some degree. Sometimes your first go around, you spend 8-10 grand learning the process, whatever, like that's a cost of business sometimes in doing that. But knowing the difference and knowing what you're looking for and being more clear. Some of the greater success I have are actually companies that already know of each other and know each other than strangers meeting, because there's at least some understanding and crossover. If you're too closely combined, it's usually not healthy. All you're doing is doubling the problems, but you're not doubling necessarily doubling the revenue. So you have to kind of be careful and understand what that's like to navigate. But it is also grueling. You're right, Lewis. It's not, it becomes another part-time job to kind of keep up with the reporting nature, some of the questions and requirements that are out there.
Yeah, it was a huge distraction that I feel like it was like it's listed among my mistakes that I feel like I made in owning my company. Like like, it was definitely like a flashy object that I was like, or flashy kind of thing that I was like excited, shiny object that I was excited about, not because I wanted to get out of the business, by the way. I just thought, maybe this is what people do. They grow a business, somebody wants to buy it, and then they go do something else. But it was a huge distraction. I just wish I had never done it.
A lot of the people I coach through this process, I encourage them to think of it going both ways. So if you're in the process of thinking of being acquired, you should at the same time be looking to acquire others, because both sides of that coin kind of work in tandem. If it's smart to be acquired and you find the right opportunity, it would be smart to acquire somebody. But that critical thinking of looking and being seen at the same time really help you focus on those opportunities to know what win-win feels like for you. And get out soon. I think making the mistake of hanging on too long, looking at the warning signs and just not leaving is such a huge mistake that people make. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a sunk cost bias associated with that, which I understand, but I agree. Cut bait quickly is advice I wish I had a few years ago, for sure. And I think your point, Tim, about thinking if you're ready to be acquired, asking yourself if you're ready to acquire is a really nice way to think about it. And one of the things I'm observing right now, just the season that our industry is in, is that sometimes the best path for success for smaller creative firms is looking within the peer group, looking for specialized firms with whom you share not just opportunity, but also values.
Yeah.
So for me, that is a really big thing. You can find opportunities where values are aligned, and as a result, businesses can grow. Your businesses can grow together in a healthy way that isn't really just about the idea that like M&A is sick and I could make a 6 or 7 figure paycheck if I just did this thing because that's what people do.
Especially if you're both running RevThink's Creo S system, then you're
Hey,
such a win. Go ahead, Phil. That's a little plug for
Um,
me, by the way.
so
That's all that was. That was just a gracious plug. Go ahead, Joe.
you got
I
to
mean,
do it
Phil.
sometime.
at RevThink, you have what,
Thanks, dude.
700 to 800 founders. Like, how many successful exit have you seen, and what's the average multiplier?
So truly most acquisitions that people have are what I call acqui-hires. It's usually the very first offer that you get, and really the most easy offer. And what that means is, why don't you just come join me and you can keep your job, and make the same pay, but not worry about the taxes and overhead and that kind of stuff. So a lot of people, they're very thankful for that. They might be tired and done and just want somebody else's oversight on the business, and they kind of just wanted to have a job and do it, which is, it's perfect for a lot of people for a lot of seasons that they're in. But the acqui-hire process can be a little bit of a bummer when there's an equity piece at play and you don't have as much control as you used to. So you might be owed $1 million and they offer you $500,000 in equity and $500,000 in cash. And that $500,000 equity starts eventually becoming worth very little, because the job you're doing or the position you have isn't really worth the effort that you had into it. When you were running the business and can control it, there's a little bit, more excitement. So a lot of discernment is kind of necessary in those moments. And those are the smaller agencies. Acqui-hires are really, really common for smaller agencies. It's why I encourage you to think about acquiring somebody else, because if it's an acqui-hire, you can say, listen, I'm tired of running my business. You're young and ready to take on this new venture. How about I acquire you and you start running my business? You basically become the CEO of my business through this acquisition. And I can let down my guard a little bit, delegate some of that work to you, but I don't have to lose all the control. And that offer you're making somebody else can kind of have that comparison to it.
Yeah.
But to answer your first question, Phil, it's not common. Most people do not exit well or exit with anything of equity, and they're just kind of like, they're done. A project takes them out. end of season, end of career kind of season. And they're like, okay, they didn't put the effort into that 7-year period soon enough to make it worth the effort for the exit. So that's, it's not as good as well as many as I'd want it to be.
Okay, and you mentioned equity. Like, how how much worth is it like to accept equity? Because sometimes, like, if you have like, as you said, like 500,000 in equity, like you cannot liquidify it. So how do you what do you do with
Yeah.
that? And sometimes I've been offered equity, and I'm like, I don't know if it's a good deal. So what's the term, or what's your take on that?
I mean,
Yeah.
Tyler,
Equity
we've
is
talked
tricky.
about
There's,
this. Yeah.
yeah. Go ahead, Joe. Sure.
Equity only has value if there is an opportunity for a liquidity event. Like, you know what I mean? We've talked about this ad nauseum. And so the question is, if you accept that equity, what are the future opportunities for liquidity events? And that is a question you, of course, have the right to ask, right? To do research on, but to also ask very directly. Well, what are the liquidity opportunities here? And if the answer is there aren't any unless we get acquired, then you have been offered $500,000 of nothing,
Yeah.
unless you want to die at that company, right? Like,
I can tell you an example really recently with two agencies that were closely related. I'd say one, to summarize, one focused more on live action and one focused more on post, but they were enough closely related. But when they combined, the multiplier went from 3 times to 5 times. Just by combining the revenue and the savings of the overhead, all of a sudden changed their profit game. And the company doing the acquiring was also looking at exiting in the next 3 years. So together, combined, they said, let's put our efforts together and over the next 3 years, really focus on our combined exit. And by doing this, we both gain than if we try to sell separately. So they combine the efforts together and then work together or they're working together now over the next 3 years for that liquidity event. In that case, the equity is really important because I might have come into this relationship with a 2 times multiplier on my EBITDA, but now I have 50% equity in this combined deal. My 2.5 times is going to be worth 4 times. My equity piece of it's going to be worth 4 times on the exit, and I get more from the other return. I mean, in this case, might be another $1 million or $1.5 million, based off of that. Good to see you, Terry.
Like, why would two company be worth more when they're together versus, like, if you buy, like, one pack of chip at the corner store versus three, you're gonna get a deal. So why wouldn't you like separate your companies instead of like combining them?
Yeah, well, because again, like think about like company A has a 2.5 times multiplier because their revenue and expenses and EBITDA look like a 2.5, and company B has the same 2.5 times multiplier. But when I combine them together, I have monopoly control over this Google pipeline. So now I have all the live action and all the post production for this segment of Google's work. Same revenue, same EBITDA, but now I've locked myself into, more recurring revenue, possibility for growth, blah, 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 blah. And that strength over a 3-year period. Now, if the acquiring company says, could you do the same thing for Meta? Obviously, I can go do it. And so the overall look after 3 years of proof kind of locks in something very unique because of the way they did it. You might combine Marvel with Disney. You might combine, you might be able to just combine certain things together and make that match take place. So that's what you're looking at, is a strategic partnership in that way to see if that combined effort does get it to you. If you're wrong, then it's 2.5 times. Well, you got the same dollars, but if you can get it to 4, more power to you. So it was worth the effort of doing it. And in that case, equity was important to all the parties because they all wanted that control, oversight, and gain from the second liquidity event. Yeah. Or the second merger. Good questions, by the way.
Thank you so much. I have to jet, but thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
appreciate it, Lewis.
Lewis, I'll email you about that other thing.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, cool.